Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is The Current Podcast.
As Americans, we are bound together by a single fate and a shared destiny. We rise together or we fall apart. I am running to be president for all of America, not half of America, because there is no victory in winning for half of America. So tonight, with faith and devotion, I proudly accept your nomination for President of the United States. Thank you.
It was a change of tone for Donald Trump as he started his speech at the Republican convention last night, 5 days after an assassination attempt at a campaign rally. He told the story of that day to huge applause, but then the tone changed again.
We had that horrible, horrible result that we'll never let happen again. They used COVID to cheat. We're never going to let it happen again. What this administration, the damage that this administration has done, and I say it often, if you took the 10 worst presidents in the history of the United States, think of it, the 10 worst, added them up, they will not have done the damage that Biden has done. Only going to use the term once. The damage that he's done to this country is unthinkable. It's unthinkable.
We've reached the CBC's Katie Simpson at the airport. She's waiting for a plane there after covering the convention. Katie, good morning.
Good morning.
We were supposed to see a fundamentally changed Donald Trump last night after he was shot at. What did we see after that 90-minute record-length speech in the end?
I think one of the clips you played there actually perfectly sort of sets the scene for what at least I saw. Remember when Donald Trump said, listen, I want to govern for all of America. There's no point in representing half the country or winning for half the country. Basically, his speech sort of started out perhaps with a goal of appealing to all Americans and trying to really unite and create that sense of unity. However, once that speech sort of took the turn, it really was only aimed at maybe, say, half the country. If half the country represents his supporters, it turned into a campaign-style rally that really only appealed to the people who are in his inner circle in that room. The crowd loved it. The crowd absolutely inside that arena loved it. But when it came to trying to make that bigger, broader appeal, he leaned into some of the personal grievances that he so often does. And he used really divisive, racially charged language when it came to immigration. And so we saw the things that Donald Trump normally does. He walked out onto that stage. He was more subdued. He told his story about surviving an assassination attempt. And that it really was a remarkable thing to witness, hearing his version of events. But as he told that story, there are all those things that make Trump the guy that the people in that audience love. There's some exaggerations, and then as the speech went on, there was misinformation, there was the election fraud lie, those kinds of things. So it may have started with one tone, and then it hit sort of like a turning point and went back to the same Donald Trump that everyone pretty much is used to.
And you say misinformation. There were some downright falsehoods in the speech. What did he say about what the next few months, years might look like?
Well, the big thing that really gets people excited at the convention, and the big thing that he's really been focusing on, is immigration. And he wants to conduct the largest mass deportation in U.S. history. He has the slogan, "Build the Wall." That really gets everyone excited. And he talks about immigrants and people who cross into the United States, migrants seeking a better life. He used some pretty difficult language, and difficult is very much an understatement. He blamed illegal immigrants in the United States for things like disease and poverty and crime. And throughout his campaign, we've seen him do this for years. Instead of taking a look at crime, sort of broad issues in society, he focuses in on crimes committed by people who are not supposed to be in the United States, and sort of highlights them as a bigger as a campaign point, stoking fear. Fear is a motivator for politicians, and we heard that last night, Donald Trump leaning into that divisive rhetoric again.
And he has been so divisive, even within the Republican Party. Did you see any of that at the convention?
Here's the thing. No. It was everyone is here united behind Trump. I didn't hear a single person say a negative word about him. And we talked to, so many people day after day after day. The people who are in this audience are the Trump base, and they were so excited. They are so energized and galvanized, and they really saw this as a moment of unity. When Donald Trump's former challengers, Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, walked out onto that stage and offered their endorsement and their support, they saw that as the Republican Party coming together. Never mind that the Never Trumper faction of the conservative movement in the United States, they were not present and not participating in this event.
And of course, I mean, that's what conventions are for. I mean, they're about getting the crowd excited. We saw Hulk Hogan, ripping off his shirt, with Kid Rock playing on stage. But what's your sense of how ready the Republican Party is for this upcoming election?
Well, if it's anything like the convention was sort of a well-oiled political machine. Think about conventions as like a 4-day commercial for a political party. And all of the sort of notes that they aimed to hit, they kind of hit them. It's just whether those notes are what American voters are looking for and whether it actually, is able to allow Donald Trump to expand his base. That's the big key thing here in the United States. This election is going to come down to a handful of swing states, a handful of counties where there are undecided voters, and where the turnout could decide who is going to become the next president of the United States. And really, his job is to sort of find a way to reach those voters, to try and get them on side, get them to turn out, and convince them that he is the person to lead this country into the next 4 years for the next term. So it's whether he was able to do that, that's going to sort of be the big test to see if he gets any sort of bump. But when it comes to these kinds of conventions, it's all about pageantry. It's for television. It's for social media. It's all these big moments. It looked to be a well-oiled machine.
And of course, trying to paint themselves as a real contrast with the Democrats right now. I've got to ask you, Katie, while I've got you here, so much conversation about Joe Biden stepping aside as the Democrats' nominee. That has just keeps growing and growing, and it's not going away. Where's that stand right now?
I think the best way to describe what's going on with the Democrats right now is what a mess. We're seeing more and more members of the Democratic Party come forward to nudge Joe Biden to step aside. And I think the big contrast that the United States saw over the past 4 days, you have this well-oiled machine, Republicans who are enthusiastic and excited, ready to go, the circus, the pomp and circumstance of everything that was going on here. And you contrast that with Democrats who aren't sure who their presidential nominee is going to be, the infighting, the leaking of stories. They're eating each other. They are cannibalizing themselves. And it is, how much longer is it going to go on until they can sort of find a path forward? Is it, just getting behind Joe Biden? It seems that the key members of the party are not willing to do that. They can see the writing on the wall. They're looking at the internal polling. They can see the display that the Republicans put on. It's such a clear contrast. And so it's going to be a difficult moment for Democrats to sort of get it together. They've got about a month or so before their convention. And if they don't get it together, all it does is help Republicans.
And as you were at the Republican convention, I mean, how are they reacting to that Democratic infighting?
Largely, they loved it. They were not necessarily surprised to see sort of what's going on in the party. And with Joe Biden's cognitive decline, they say that they've been pointing this out, that, Joe Biden is not worthy of being president, let alone running for president again. And so I did talk to some people who sort of didn't take any joy in what they're seeing. They sort of looked at Joe Biden and seeing as a reminder of like their elderly parent. I had talked to one woman. She's like, look, he reminds me of my dad and my elderly father when he's sort of to age and he wasn't the same person that he used to be. And he thought it was sad. And she was very frustrated that Democrats let it get to that point. She's a Republican. She's a conservative. She votes Republican. And she was just saddened by the whole thing. So we heard some of that in addition to as well as people, really excited that the Democrats are not united.
Katie, it sounds like there may be movement at the airport there. I'm going to let you go so you can go and catch your plane. Yeah, absolutely. Katie, thank you so much for filing this. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
Katie Simpson is a senior foreign correspondent for CBC News, and we reached her at the airport. Joining me now for a look at what a second Trump term could look like is Daniel Drezner. He's a distinguished professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Daniel, good morning.
Good morning, Duncan.
Watching the Republican convention play out this week, hearing Trump speak last night, how does 2024 Donald Trump and the Republican Party compare to what we saw in 2016?
I think the biggest difference is that it is now Donald Trump's party. You have to remember when Trump was elected in 2017, he went through a primary where there were 16 other candidates who sounded very different from how he sounded. He had to staff his first term mostly with what at the time were mainstream Republicans who didn't necessarily agree with him, particularly on issues of foreign policy. That was then, and this is now. And, your correspondent talked about how the convention was so unified, and that is unsurprising. It's also worth noting that there was no single former president or vice president who attended that RNC. And the reason for that was that in most cases, they have serious disagreements with Donald Trump and with the rest of the party at this point. But if Trump gets elected, he's going to have a Congress, a Republican Congress that is much more loyal to him. And he's going to have an administration where he has cabinet officials and sub-cabinet officials that are much more in tune with his policy. The story of the last 8 years has been Donald Trump's essentially successful colonization of the GOP and really turning the GOP into a party that resembles policies from the interwar period more than it does from the last 70 years.
You said if Donald Trump wins the election. I want to go through a few big items that will feel the impact of a change in government if it should happen. Let's start with the economy. What are Trump's campaign's plans for the economy?
Well, Trump has promised a series of measures, the most significant of which would be not just an extension of the tax cuts that he passed in 2017, which are set to expire next year, but in some ways doubling down on them. I think he wants to reduce the corporate tax rate to 15%. He wants to reduce upper income tax rates significantly as well. In addition to that, he has promised to raise tariffs significantly up to 100%, as well as I believe he said during the convention speech, the greatest deportation since the Eisenhower administration. He also very much wants to see interest rates cut, although not before the election, once he's been elected. If you combine all of these measures, you are essentially going to guarantee very high inflation in the United States. The combination of tax cuts, interest rates cuts, and significant protectionism all will raise prices significantly, which is going to lead to significant amounts of inflation, which is ironic given Trump's pledge to actually cause prices to fall during his convention speech.
You mentioned the protectionism. How might that impact trading partners like Canada?
It's not one of the things about Trump's first term, if you recall, is that he would implement across the board tariff increases and then create exceptions for where he recognized or where his advisors recognized it would cause serious disruptions to the economy. So it is entirely possible that Canada will be, on the outside looking in terms of tariff cuts. The problem is that because, Canada is a member of the USMCA and because Trump, even in the speech last night, declared that to be the greatest trade deal ever, it would be there's a decent chance that Canada would be accepted from any of those sorts of trade measures. I think the region that would bear the brunt of Trump's tariffs would be the European Union. Trump looks at the EU in the same way that he looks at Russia and China. He views it as a rival much more so than as a partner. And so I would say it's the allies further away from the United States that would pay the highest price as a result of those tariff increases.
Let's turn to foreign policy. Coming out of the recent NATO meetings, leaders there expressed concern about the U.S. under Trump taking, again, an isolationist approach. How do you see U.S. aid and military interventions changing if Trump wins?
I think it's incorrect to call Trump an isolationist. Trump is just a mercantilist who wants to bomb different countries. In the sense of Trump, it is true, would probably want to retrench from U.S. commitments to Europe and the Pacific Rim. But if you heard his convention speech and if you've heard Republicans talk about Latin America, for the last year or two, they've been quite emphatic about using military force in Mexico and Central America, even in South America, to deal with what they see as, waves of illegal immigration, along with the fentanyl crisis, which is primarily coming through Central America. And the Republicans are quite confident that military force can potentially solve these problems. So in that sense, actually, the Republican Party is turning back to the foreign policy of the 19th century, when the U.S. used to intervene regularly in Latin America.
We saw again him returning to those familiar themes of illegal migrants in his term last night in his speech. Immigration under Trump, of course, it saw building of the border wall, controversial family separations, amongst other policies. What do you predict a second term might look like?
Well, I would point out that he didn't actually build much of the wall. He claimed that he had built all of it, but I think he only wound up building something like 20 miles of it. But that said, obviously, you would see continued construction of that wall. As I said, in his speech, he promised the greatest deportation program since the Eisenhower administration. You would see the significant mobilization of the U.S. government, not just Customs and Border Patrol, but probably the National Guard as well, trying to round up migrants that are undocumented. He has talked about the creation. He and his immigration advisor, Stephen Miller, have talked about the creation of internment camps, essentially to process these kinds of migrants. My prediction would be that this will not necessarily work terribly well, but one of the things you would be likely to see would be significant social protests as a result of this. And to get a little dire, it would not surprise me if you see a mass casualty event. Donald Trump, I think, firmly believes that only this sort of exercise of real force will intimidate those who potentially resist him. And it would not surprise me if both Trump and Stephen Miller actually welcomed that kind of confrontation as a way of essentially trying to diffuse or to intimidate those who oppose the Trump administration position on immigration to organize.
Interestingly, in his speech last night, he did not mention abortion. What does a Trump-Vance administration mean for women's reproductive health in your country?
So obviously, with the Dobbs decision, abortion has been left to the states. It seems highly unlikely to me that a national abortion ban would get through Congress. It would not get past a Senate filibuster. So in the end, you could argue that potentially that decision would be left to the states, but it would also not surprise me at all if the federal government tried to implement measures to essentially make it extremely difficult for women living in states where abortion is illegal to move or to get abortions in states where it is legal. So you could see things like travel restrictions and or National Guard at state borders trying to prevent people from, let's say, Florida trying to get to places like Massachusetts.
A last question for you. I can't help but wonder, what impact the recent Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity will have on what we might see from the Oval Office?
To put it gently, that is a literal get-out-of-jail-free card for Donald Trump or potentially for any president going forward, because the ruling makes it next to impossible to prosecute a president for even unofficial crimes, given how difficult it would be to try to get the evidence. So, Trump has seen this as a vindication of his theory of executive power, which basically says the president can do whatever they want within the executive branch. So one of the other things you are likely to see if he gets elected is a significant purging of the civil service. There's a program that he wanted to implement in his first term that he will implement in his second term called Schedule F that would categorize a whole wide array of civil service employees that he viewed as resisting his policies in his first term that would enable him to fire them and replace them with much more concerted loyalists. So you would see significant turmoil within the executive branch if he gets elected.
Daniel Drezner, it's good to talk policy. I appreciate you sharing your analysis on this.
Thank you for having me.
Daniel Drezner is a distinguished professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University.